Hi, I'd like to demonstrate a few changes to the release workflow of the Gutenberg plugin, which come from this PR here. We're currently using a shell script that we run manually on our machines to kick off the Gutenberg plugin release process, where we can select whether to create a release candidate or a stable release and provide a changelog that we paste into an editor, upon which the script will create a commit with a version bump and a new tag and push these to the GitHub repository, which will then trigger GitHub Actions workflow that will build the actual plugin as a zip and create a release draft in this section here, releases. We're currently on version 10.1.1. Actually, we've already released a release candidate for 10.2.0, as is visible here, for example, from the changelog. And I will now demonstrate from a fork of the official repository what it looks like to hypothetically release version 10.2.0 stable. We're using the fork in order not to actually spoil and tarnish the actual Gutenberg code. All right, so let's get started. We go to the Actions tab here and select the Build Gutenberg plugin zip workflow. And the workflow is now entirely contained in the GitHub UI, basically, so no more shell scripts needed. We're informed by this blue banner that we can, in somewhat cryptic words, that we can trigger this manually. And there's this little nifty drop down here, which allows us to actually kick off this workflow. This upper drop down here comes from GitHub. We cannot suppress this. We have to select the base branch, but I've made it so that the action will only run if that base branch is set to trunk. And we have to select whether to create a release candidate or a stable version. So let's enter stable here. The GitHub UI is fairly brittle in terms of customization. We cannot, for example, have a radio button or a drop down here. It's just this text field. I've also made it so that the workflow is only run if either is entered. Otherwise, it will just do nothing. So let's see what happens. This should queue this newly run workflow. Here it goes. Queue it now. Let's see what it does. It consists of 3 jobs. A bit of workflow parlance here. The whole thing is a workflow consisting of various jobs. And these 2 are pre-existing. As I said before, we were already using GitHub Actions to build the actual Gutenberg plugin zip, aka release artifact, and to create a release draft. Well, we've added this one, which just finished successfully. And this is the version bump job, which basically does what the shell script did previously, which is computing the new version number and, if necessary, creating a new release branch, switching to the branch, committing the version bump and cherry picking to trunk. Since these have finished successfully, we should be able to see these commits on the trunk branch. Here it goes. It's attributed to this sudo bot here. Yep, looking pretty good. And it should also have been committed to the release 10.2 branch. Also looking pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty much the same commit here. You might notice, if you're familiar with the release workflow as it was, that there's no change to the changelog yet. And the reason for this is mostly because that's the way that, well, it's because of how GitHub works. I wanted the entire workflow to be contained in GitHub, and there's really not a good opportunity to edit the changelog prior to this point. So what we're doing instead is we will be using, let's go back to the actions. We will be using the release draft to edit those. We're still waiting here for the release to be built. I will pause the recording and I'll pick it back up once we're done here, and I'll showcase the rest of the workflow. Okay, welcome back. The release workflow has completed successfully. It took a little under 6 minutes, of which a little under 5 minutes went into the actual plugin build. and the rest was spent on the version bump and the release draft creation. And this means we should now be able to find the release draft in the releases section of GitHub. So we can navigate there through code and by following this little releases link here. And voila, we really have a draft here for 10.0 release, and we can edit it here. Whoops. And it's pre-populated with these changelog entries, and it's worthy of note that we have this little heading here that is apparently coming from the release candidate. And in fact, everything below that heading comes from the existing changelog.txt that was last updated when the release candidate was published. Whereas everything on top of that heading comes from the release changelog generation script that is run by the release workflow that we just ran at the time of the release creation. And this basically found one PR that was apparently cherry-picked to the release branch after the release candidate was published. So this is quite handy. It means we still have a bit of manual work to do. We have like this bug fixes session here. We should obviously remove the heading from the release candidate. And the bug fixes heading is duplicated down here. So we just move this thing down here and delete this one. And in practice, especially if this was a release candidate, we would normally try to predefine the whole thing here a bit, like maybe identify common subjects here and group them under maybe not subheadings, but like bullet points with more indentation and so on. And we can, if we want to come back to this because we want to, for example, find out what's happened in a certain PR, we can save the draft and come back later. And once we're happy, and only then can we publish the release. Because this is kind of final, the release notes, as we've added them here, will be copied as such into the changelog.txt. So ideally, this should be in a good shape by the time we're publishing this. It'll be both committed back to the GitHub repo, and it'll be used for the changelog that is then going to be uploaded to the WordPress.org SVN repository for plugins. Let's do this. Again, this is running in a kind of a sandbox thingy. Nothing's really going to be published here, but we can demonstrate what happens, which is, among other things, this is now marked as the latest release. This tag was actually only generated now. GitHub supports this mode of tag creation. That's only created at the time a release draft is published, which is quite handy. Let's see here into the Actions tab actually, because we have now, by publishing this release, triggered the workflow to update the changelog and to update to upload the Gutenberg plugin to the plugin repo. It's running here, and this is also overall pre-existing. We had this job to upload the Gutenberg plugin to SVN already, and what we've added now in this latest PR are these extra jobs that are taking care of updating the changelog. They've just finished. Let's check out the changelog on the trunk branch, and we see there's actually a commit that was just performed by our little pseudo robot here, and this actually did pretty exactly what we were just describing. It updated the changelog. It's smart enough to identify if the previous changelog entry was for a release candidate. The whole thing is going to be replaced by the file, by the stable release. And we find the gallery block item that was added after the release candidate and that we now moved back down here. That looks good. Yeah. Here the order of some items seems to have changed, but that's not a big deal. Okay. And this is looking pretty good overall. Now the final step that we still need to do is we have to approve of this last step here. Since this will upload the Gutenberg plugin to SVN, to the actual WordPress.org plugin repo, this requires extra permissions. It requires approval by a member of the Gutenberg core team. This is also visible in this yellow banner here. Pay attention, maybe take note of this little clock icon. Might be something you haven't seen before, because normally we have like this yellow dot just indicating that a job is ongoing. The clock means we're waiting for approval here. And this means if you are not a member of the Gutenberg core team, this is the moment where you will have to ask someone to give approval for this. Since I'm a member myself, I can do this myself here. And I just have to select this thing and approve it. And this final job will now upload the plugin, well, not to the actual WordPress.org SVN repo, but to a SVN repo that I created for testing purposes.